Okay, so welcome guys to part two of our Cold War series, and this is Fear, Close Calls, and Conflict. And so this is just a list of some of the more important topics that we're going to talk about today. This left-hand column over here will be issues we're dealing with the Red Scare in America. So this is a domestic issue. And then over here on this right-hand column will be international incidents that will further compound the Cold War into a more tense and probably dangerous situation. So to get into it, HUAC, which is the abbreviation or otherwise known as the House Un-American Committee's activity, started. And it began to investigate a full range of radical groups, so fascists and communists, anyone who was not fully in the mainstream American political model. And additionally, some other things that began once communism was a feared entity in the United States. Truman starts to investigate whether federal workers are loyal, and if they're disloyal, would bar them from working for our government. We'll see a little bit more detail in just a sec, but the Smith Act made it a crime to say you were going to overthrow the government or to belong to some government or some agency or organization that promoted that. The McCarran Act limited the rights of communist organizations. So previously there had been, a lot of political freedom of association and of thought and free speech, but we'll see that communists are limited here in the Red Scare era. And often that's backed up by these spy cases we'll get a little bit more detail about. In the late 40s, there were three cases in particular that really stoked the fears of people in this time period. So getting a little bit more in depth, the House Un-American Activities Committee in particular focused on one area that we're going to talk about, and that is Hollywood. The media, holds a lot of influence and sway over America then and now. And we'll say HUAC began to ask some questions about the beliefs of individuals who work in show business and the things that they were promoting in their films, and what became famously known as the Hollywood 10. Essentially, some actors and directors refused to start to answer some of the questions that this committee from the House of Representatives is asking. And essentially the backlash was this, that if you didn't testify or if you didn't give names or somehow work with the House Un-American Activities Committee, you were put on a blacklist. And essentially these guys lose their career, and many others, simply by not following through with this investigation on their communist links or lack thereof. And so we'll see guilt by association is one of the main ideas that comes around through the Red Scare. And so we can see a political cartoonist, Herb Bloch, famously, we worked with this one in class, but this kind of chaos and the recklessness of HUAC running over the public, trying to find and hunt down those communists. It was dangerous business in the late 40s and into the early 50s. And President Truman gets on the bandwagon. People began to question if he was soft on communism. Obviously, his foreign policy would probably indicate otherwise, but to relay any fears that people had, he began to investigate basically what's called the loyalty program, but that all federal employees must ensure that they're loyal citizens, right? And I don't know if it's good proof or not, but essentially he didn't find much. His investigative system didn't really turn up any large evidence of disloyalty, and I guess that satisfied some people that that Truman and the executive branch was active in about fighting communism in the government. So here's an example that you could take a look at. So this is what people would have to do, right? The standards for employment, right? That activities and applications, associations of an applicant or employee which may be considered in connection, determined with disloyalty, may include one of the following. So this is a long list, right, of basically things that you can't be a part of, and that if you are, you're probably not going to be a loyal American, so they try to spell it out in a little bit detail. But anytime you're talking loyalty and disloyalty, there is some subjectiveness, and so lots of people probably faced harsher criticism than I don't know, maybe they were used to. Moving on, the Smith Act pushes this up a little further, and several leaders of the Communist Party were charged under the Smith Act, and basically it made it a crime to call for the overthrow of the government, and essentially the Communist Party in the United States was advocating, obviously, for the end of the democratic and capitalist system in the U.S. And so we'll see these convictions were upheld by the Supreme Court in Dennis v. U.S. Additionally, the McCarran Act we spoke about earlier required that communist organizations register with the government, so they had to have additional government oversight, and there was a special board to investigate them. So some additional kind of observations by the government simply based around the ideology these people were holding, and it made it illegal to plan a dictatorship, and they wanted to prevent obviously communism from spreading and getting into the United States. And this is really what probably makes those two laws, especially important, is there were 3 spy cases that developed in the late 40s. So Alger Hiss was in the State Department, and he was essentially convicted for being a spy for the Soviets. Technically, he was charged with perjury, lying under oath. And his conviction is still debated to some degree. Klaus Fuchs was pretty much completely guilty, as the facts kind of lay out, but essentially he was involved in the Manhattan Project developing the A-bomb, and he gives a lot of that information to the Soviets, which really fast forward their efforts to develop the bomb. And Ethel and Julius Rosenberg are convicted of, once again, passing secrets to the Soviets, and they were executed. While Julius is pretty clearly guilty, his wife may be less guilty, but once again, that guilt of association. So careful who you marry. And really it notches up when Joseph McCarthy, who was new to politics and really jumped on this communism bandwagon to gain political points, claims he has 205 known communists working in the State Department. And him and Truman obviously didn't see eye to eye, right, as he calls him a Balooey artist. And we'll see that a lot of critics were available for McCarthy at the time, essentially that he's spreading fear and false accusations, right? This photo, doctored photo, and this fake letter. Basically, that McCarthyism becomes kind of this word that is synonymous with, accusations that seem a little outlandish and that lack some support. But initially, he had a lot of public support, as he seemed to be the authority on the matter and had insider information. But eventually, it'll come to light that he lacks in evidence. And McCarthyism's claims, like I said, were backed up rarely with evidence, but he did succeed in making a special effort to defeat Maryland Senator Millard Tynee, and so basically essentially tried to make him linked to communism of some sorts and shame his opponent. And really this goes beyond McCarthyism in the federal government and really gets into other branches of the government, into universities, into unions, right, into private businesses, where people are really starting to look around and see if there are communists among us. So this mass hysteria and fear really permeates the culture. And we can see that McCarthyism does have a downfall. So it's a double-edged sword. Once you start to accuse people, people might start pushing back. And so he continues and making even more and wilder claims. He starts to go after Republicans, so he's kind of eating his own. And probably the last straw is he starts to attack the U.S. Army, claiming that it was protecting communists. And really, that was the end. Once he started to accuse the military and he didn't have any credible evidence, then McCarthyism kind of fades. And sadly, he dies of alcoholism, just a couple of years later. And so switching gears now onto a foreign policy. So in 1960, JFK is elected. And so JFK and Khrushchev, two new leaders to both respective countries, right, meet in Berlin to discuss nuclear proliferation, essentially trying to limit how many atomic bombs each country produces. And Khrushchev thinks that JFK is young and inexperienced and can be pushed around. And we're going to see he's going to try to push him. And one of the pushes early on is the Berlin Wall, which you can see here, right, separating east and west, separates out these two halves of the city. And so this is a physical, but also probably a symbolic barrier between the east and the west, between communism and democracy. And Checkpoint Charlie is a pretty famous, entrance from east to west. And moving on. JFK kind of responds by notching up the rhetoric. He goes and speaks to West Berlin, right? So in the heart of East Germany, and he says, "Ich bin ein Berliner," which essentially, is saying that I'm with you. I'm a Berliner. There is some debate about there if he said the wrong thing, and essentially he could have said, "I am a jelly donut." A Berliner is also a type of donut, but most people gave the president pass in his German and knew what he meant. But this was a pretty symbolic and political gesture. And we'll see closer to our home, right? The Cubans have a revolution from 53 to 59, and it's led by Fidel Castro, and him and his communist supporters oust Batista, who was a dictator, but at least an ally of the United States. And so communism arises pretty close to our borders. And Khrushchev quickly makes friends with young Castro here in 61. So the Soviets are promising support for this new communist government just south of the United States. And we'll see that JFK did not like this, so he pushes back. In particular, other elements of the government encourage him to do so, like the CIA and the military. And this would be called what's called the Bay of Pigs. But essentially, this is a failed invasion to overthrow Castro. Essentially, they sent Cuban dissidents, so people who were in Florida, Cubans who fled after the revolution, and they send them back with some military support. And their idea was they were going to start an uprising. And it is a complete failure and a really black eye for the president. Additionally, in 62, this Khrushchev Kennedy standoff heats up even more as the Cuban Missile Crisis goes. We'll talk more about this in class, but essentially the Soviets send missiles into the island of Cuba for its own protection, but also a looming threat to the United States, right? And obviously you can think that this is of huge concern for the U.S., right? This range, they can wipe out major U.S. cities or military installations. And the United States, there's this huge standoff for 13 days that we'll talk about in class, but essentially this ratchets it up. This is the highest peak, probably, I would say, of the tension between the U.S. and the Soviets. For 13 days, we didn't know if we were going to have an atomic war at hand. Eventually, the military kind of identifies different examples of the buildup that the Soviets are using to put these missiles into Cuba. And essentially it's a game of chicken, right? Kind of a famous saying, we went eyeball to eyeball with the Russians and the other man blinked. A pretty dangerous game. The end story is essentially the Soviets make a deal, and they say that they'll take the missiles out if the United States secretly or not publicly takes their missiles out of Cuba. All right, so we're back, and other things, we'll spend a lot more time talking about this, but just to intro, the war in Vietnam gets started earlier than 65, but significant U.S. contributions start to come in 65 to 73, and we'll see this will define, to some extent, the Cold War gets hot, right, in Vietnam between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, but in the context of North and South Vietnam. And also in 68, there's what's called the Prague Spring. Essentially, the Czech president pushes for a more reformed and human face to communism, and the Soviets disagree, and they say you can't do that, so they push their tanks